film. And we're also really lucky to be joined by a comrade of mine and brilliant mind, Phindile Kunene, who holds an MA in history from Wits. She's an activist herself, and she's been involved in youth and student movements, trade unions, and currently works as an educator and curriculum specialist in service to activist organizations. I think it would be great if we could open the floor to our speakers, and then we'll have an engagement afterwards. Each of the speakers has 15 minutes, and we're going to be engaging with a case study on some of the pedagogy advice that they have and some of the experiences on how to teach economics and create an environment that is a lot more pluralist and inclusive and, I dare say, decolonial in its nature, since these are some of the main focuses of REFA. I also remember that it's been 50 years since Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And really the fundamental message in the book that was actually banned in South Africa during apartheid was that education and how education is taught can be a tool for good or a tool for evil. It can be a tool for freedom or a tool for subordination. And when it comes to rethinking economics, we need to not just think about what we teach and what we learn, but how we do it. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask Phindile if she can bring us into her world and share some of her wisdom.
Okay, thanks, Shai.
Sorry, Phindile. Jezri, I think you can stop sharing the screen now.
Okay. Thanks, Shaira. Thanks, everyone, for welcoming me. I've just looked at the list of participants, and I'm very excited to be part of this. I hope I'm all a bit about what I do, so that participants can also understand where I'm coming from. So for the past 5 years, I've been involved with the Chisimani Center for Activist Education, which is based in Cape Town, but does work in different parts of the country. And what we specialize in really is popular education. So I've been involved in working with trade unions in the different federations that we have. I've been involved in working with social movements, community organizations in response to basically their education needs. So running workshops, running schools, residential camps, and all of that. And it's from that standpoint that I'll be making my very brief input. And I've chosen to talk about a question that is really in the public eye at the moment. It's occupying center stage in terms of the public discourse. And this is basically the ongoing issue or the ongoing contestation around the size and the weight of the public sector wage bill. So the size and the weight of the public sector wage bill, weight insofar as public finances are concerned. So as participants would know, this is an issue that is quite heated at the moment. In fact, there's a dispute that is going on between trade unions in the public sector, both from COSATU and outside of COSATU, as well as government, principally the National Treasury, which argues that the size of the public sector wage bill is really a hindrance to government spending on other priorities, and also argues, I suppose factually, that we spend about 35% of the budget on the compensation of state employees. And the aim, as was announced in February this year, is to actually reduce that by 160 billion rands over the next 3 years, which obviously has put the state on a collision course with the unions, since there was a wage agreement that was signed after a little bit of discord and contestation in 2018. And this is basically a 3-year wage agreement that government says it can't honor at the moment because there are a range of public finance challenges that South Africa is going through. So that's just by way of background, so it's an issue that is in the media now, and there's big contestation around it, but it's an issue that's been going on really for quite some time. So as part of Chisimani and as part of the educators at Chisimani, we decided in 2018, when similar discussions were basically taking place, we decided that it would be ideal to host a workshop with the public sector unions. And there was a lot of anxiety from public sector workers at that time, because government was actually refusing to come to the table to negotiate the 3-year wage agreement. So in 2018, around March the 22nd, we hosted a workshop with about 23 to 25 public sector workers in the main, but also workers in the retail sector and workers in the textile, clothing and textile sector. And this was basically a one-day workshop titled, "Is the Public Sector Wage Bill Crowding Out Other Government Spending?" So there was quite a cheeky title to the workshop. And the aim of that really was to ask a number of questions. The first one was that, what room exists for public sector union demands in the face of government cutbacks on spending? The second question was, have unions pursued a coherent strategy to reduce the wage gaps and contain expenditure at the highest level of government bureaucracy? And then the third question was whether there are ways in which public sector unions in South Africa can imagine strategies to bargain that strike a deeper connection with working class communities and advance radical ideas about how to build a capable public service that meets people's needs in the country. So we had those questions for that workshop, which was, if I was to say, quite a dynamic and exciting workshop, largely because the participants were so passionate about the question, because most of them were actually waiting in apprehension, waiting for what's going to happen in terms of the bargaining process and whether government would come to the party on this issue. Now, in terms of how the workshop was structured, we organized the workshop around a range of activities. So starting with buzz groups, where participants in pairs looked at a collage of newspaper headlines on the public sector wage bill, some of them quite friendly, but others quite unfriendly to the public sector. So for example, there was one headline that said, "Public servants are the country's new elites," and comparing some of the wages in the private sector with wages in the public sector, and the extent to which public sector workers have been able to win above inflation increases over a sustained period of time. We then also decided to stage a debate between two opposing views, and this is really going to be the core of what I'd like to touch on in terms of methodologies and how to use techniques such as debates to basically probe participants further and to ask certain questions. So this debate was of two opposing views that were presented over video, so short video clips, and each speaker was sort of responding to the question, is the public sector wage bill crowding out other government spending? One of the speakers was from the unions and another from the National Treasury itself. And then this was followed by a short input that looked at public sector wages, what are the choices and what are the trade-offs. And this was done actually by a comrade, Neil Coleman, who gave us this presentation and facilitated a discussion based on what came out of there. And then the last component of this workshop was getting participants to formulate responses to some of the public concerns about the public service and the size of the compensation bill in the public service. So for this, we used hypothetical scenarios and role plays where groups prepared responses to a range of working class interests and organizations, such as, for instance, an organization that campaigns around pensioners' interest, or an organization that campaigns around inequality in education, or an organization that campaigns around the unequal distribution of police resources between townships and suburbs. So that was the structure of the workshop, and those were the key activities of this particular workshop in 2018. What I'm going to do is just to give an outline of what of what our two speakers in this debate basically touched on. So the first video was a response from a unionist, a union spokesperson, a COSATU spokesperson, Sizwe Pamla, who argued basically that public servants are amongst the most economically vulnerable workers in South Africa, with teachers, nurses, and the police being at the bottom of the ladder, that these workers are highly indebted and actually under severe economic strain, given the rising cost of living, and also made a very strong case for the need to cut wastage, fruitless expenditure, and to be firm on corruption in order to ease the pressure on public finances. And that workers shouldn't have to bear the brunt for prolonged mismanagement of the state, especially your state-owned enterprises and so forth. So that was the first view coming from a unionist in this debate that we staged, which was really the core of the workshop. And it is from this debate that I'd like to draw some of the key lessons that emerged from this particular workshop. The second perspective was drawn from a video by Michael Sachs, who had just left the National Treasury at that point and was located in the Gauteng Premier's office, working on budgets and budgeting. And his argument was that the compensation of government employees is a big pressure on the fiscus. It's one of the largest components of public spending at 34.2% at the time, and that this has grown faster than any category of government spending except payment for financial assets. And the fact that the factors driving this ballooning or this burgeoning public sector wage bill, according to the National Treasury, is an increase in headcount, but more so the above inflation salary increases that public sector workers have been able to fight for and win on the streets, on the bargaining table for the past 10 years or so. His argument was also that the wage increase is actually contrary to some of the arguments are highest from level 12 downwards. Now that's not, level 12 downwards actually excludes the senior management in government. It's deputy director level downwards, if that sort of makes sense. And that, and these figures are repeated again in the most recent budget review, that the compensation spending has actually tripled in the past plus minus 10 years, from 154 billion in 2006-07 to 518 billion in 2018-2019. And that this has taken place in the context of decreasing revenue and increasing debt on the part of the state. So those were the two contending views that we put together. And in order to create space for the participants to engage these two views, we asked them to watch the two videos, take notes of what each speaker, the key points from each speaker's input, evaluate the inputs on their own, and then come together as a group to basically share their perspectives and to take a motivated stance on the issues raised. Now, I'm going to go quickly into some of the lessons that sort of emerged, or what came out of this technique or this experimentation with this form of debate. So the first thing was that most of the groups, except one, actually coalesced around the argument as articulated by the COSATU spokesperson, which held quite a lot of appeal among the participants. There was somewhat of a little consideration given to the opposing view. So the opposing view was largely dismissed as part of the neoliberal attack on workers. We have to close ranks against our class enemies, partly true, uttered by different groups to the cheers of the rest of the class, as it were. And some of the prompts by the facilitators and questions about the two arguments actually did very little to make the workers, the participants, to consider the other side. So we thought this is quite interesting, actually, and it led us to actually ask questions about why is it out of the 5 groups, 4 coalesced around the COSATU argument, and 1, with some contestation, took a different stance. So this was quite interesting for us, and we came to some conclusions about what we could have done differently to stimulate more debate and to actually ensure that the workshop was more robust than it was. So the first lesson here is really about the question of plurality of perspectives, including perspectives that we may not necessarily agree with. And the first thing to say here is that without a creative way of presenting contending views, participants tend to gravitate to what is most familiar. So the most familiar voice is the one that basically wins at the end of the day. And obviously, the COSATU voice was most familiar to the workers, and that's the voice that workers identified with the most, because that's your federation, that's your union, so to speak. So we started thinking about, could we have done this differently? And we came to the conclusion that using fictional characters, still representing the same arguments, but using fictional characters and hypothetical scenarios can actually be a very useful way around this particular challenge. And it's also useful to use art, performance, and role plays, and a range of other creative techniques that not only allow us to tackle different views, but to also simplify concepts and to make them accessible to the audience, while at the same time perhaps creating a little bit of a distance between the participants and some of the views that they are asked to consider and to tackle. So that's sort of the first lesson that emerged under this heading, a plurality of perspective is important as a practice, as a principle, but also as a practice, and we really have to think seriously about the techniques and methodologies we use to facilitate that. So it's not just enough to present 2 contending views. One has to get more creative in doing this. The second conclusion that we came to was that a workshop with workers from the same union or federation actually does limit the nature of the discussion in terms of its robust nature, but it also limits the types of questions that come up. So in this case, it was interesting that the majority of workers actually came from the public sector unions, but the workers from the clothing and textile union and the workers from the retail union, SARChI, actually asked very important questions. And so there was a moment there for cross-learning between workers who are organized in different sectors of the economy and workers in the public sector. So some of the examples, an example of some of the questions asked is, could the public sector workers do more to present and frame their demands in the public interest? So an example here is that maybe instead of talking about wage increases and putting that as a solid demand, it would be important for public sector workers to also talk about the conditions of work. And I think this is particularly important and something that has been highlighted during this COVID period, that the conditions of work for public sector workers actually do have a big impact on the communities that they serve, working class communities. So that became a big question that came from workers in the retail sector and in the textile unions. The other thing is that if we were to push this further, we started thinking that if we were to push this further, perhaps we could, circumstances and politics permitting, include non-COSATU unions who are also organizing in the public sector, who have somewhat different reasoning or different motivations, but also public sector workers who belong to unions that are not represented in the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Council. So we thought that could be interesting, as well as maybe bringing in workers from the private sector or outsourced workers who are contracted in different government departments and all of that. So this question around the plurality of perspectives is not enough if the audience itself is not diverse. And that's the second conclusion that we came to. The last one, and I suppose I'm being a bit harsh here, and I'd welcome critique from the participants. But the last thing was this question of echo chambers, or the danger of echo chambers, where we're constantly hearing views that actually reinforce either what we know or what we believe in. And the conclusion was that echo chambers are not really helpful, in the sense that they ill-equip us to engage views that are opposed to our own, and make it difficult for us to understand why people or institutions, in this particular case, the National Treasury, might hold the positions or the position that they do. They also deny us the opportunity to counter some of the narratives, to engage counter narratives and some of the compelling arguments that might be coming from the opposing side. But more importantly, I think they force us into some form of political uniformity, which can be particularly dangerous for progressive politics. It's difficult to win sympathizers when we are not equipped to deal with arguments that emerge from the opposing side, however much we may hate those particular arguments, or we may disagree with those particular arguments. In conclusion, so I'm just going to this is basically a summary of the presentation. In conclusion, from this workshop, and some of these lessons actually apply to our work more broadly, and I think they are applicable to work or education in other spaces. It's important to include different perspectives and to allow participants to come to their own decision. Conceal the source if you have to, or get creative if you have to. Include a plurality of participants, so workers from different sectors, different unions, organizations, federations, all bring different experiences and different insights into the room that we all can benefit from. Use creative approaches and scenarios to make ideas and concepts more accessible. And I've already given this example about how you could integrate public voices or working class voices so that people don't reject views solely on the basis that those views come from business. People are more willing to listen to different views when they get a sense that these views actually are public voices, working class voices, with whom we may share certain interests and commonalities. So I'll stop here for now in terms of just sharing the key insights from this one workshop. Some of those insights, like I said, are applicable across our other work, some not so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phindi. I really enjoyed that. And I think there's also strategies and tactics that we can use in this presentation that you've shown us within the institution itself to drive institutional change for REFA work. And that is also a big stumbling block over and above all the other challenges we have. So I look forward to what others have to say as well when we do a Q&A. But without further delay, Jonathan, the screen is yours.
All right, thanks, Phindile. That was terrific. And I think my presentation here should have some real moments of correspondence to some of the themes that you were dealing with there. Let me see here. You can see my slideshow now? Yes, okay. All right, thank you for having me. I'm really quite excited to be here. Like I said earlier, I was actually hoping to be physically in Johannesburg at this time, but that's COVID life. I'm in the United States right now. Either way, it's nice to see you and meet you all virtually. I'm going to talk a bit today about using film as a vehicle for pedagogy of a certain kind of critical economics and for political economy, and then reflect a little bit on different kinds of maybe humanistic entry points into critical study. To get there, I first want to think really broadly on some of the big themes from REFA. And use those to hop right into a very specific example, and then zoom back out again. But as in Phindile's presentation, one thing that I'm dealing with is kind of how do you present a array of economic theory and information and opposing viewpoints about that. And I kind of think about film in doing that. But kind of at a large level, I think one of the big needs that for rethinking economics, the reason why we come together to do this, is that so often economics has just been there as a defense of the status quo. I think it's fair to say that there's been a strong kind of individualist, libertarian, laissez-faire flavor to the profession. And I think this often descends from the fact that so many of our models they're our most basic models. They're really, and the our that I'm using here is a kind of provisional sense of the discipline of economics. Things kind of often congealed well before we were involved. But the basic models of economics are beautiful and elegant, but their beauty and elegance kind of descends from the fact that they stand alone, even just any kind of classic equilibrium modeling. And to do that, what the models do, a kind of fundamental gesture in economics, is to kind of strip away the noise of social space and kind of distill whatever's going down to its kind of most basic components. And that allows kind of equilibrium and this beauty and elegance to obtain. I think a classic example of this is Gary Becker's The Economics of Discrimination. It's written in the 1950s in a very kind of ascendant neoclassical style, for those of you who are familiar with it. But to take this idea, what Gary Becker does is he kind of takes this idea of racism. He wants to deal with it from a neoclassical perspective. And in order to do that, racism is shoehorned and fit into an individual utility space. It's a preference for discrimination, and it's the amount that someone is willing to pay in order to not associate with someone of a different race. And somewhat unsurprisingly then, the policy conclusion is that there doesn't need to be any outside intervention in kind of the drivers of structural racism. Gary Becker was clearly writing with a background of the United States, but more broadly, markets would take care of discrimination, emerged from that. But what I want to think of is just how is discrimination modeled there. And just from a report published this week, I'm presenting from Massachusetts right now, not even looking too far, just literally a report published this week on racial disparities in the Massachusetts criminal justice system. The gesture I want to make here is, well, when we look to people who study race and think about race, what do they say, and does that have anything to bear with kind of what economics has proffered? And this report by Bishop, Hopkins, Obiofuma, and Owusu, they write that there's no way you can isolate the impact of unconscious bias, prejudice, and racism in generating the disparities of the criminal justice system, precisely because the interactions at various levels of structural racism and perhaps individual bias, they were too hard to disentangle in any kind of economistic model, and they were all interacting in this if not overdetermined, very determined way. So I think the big problem that I want to think about and use film to hop in is that oftentimes the models of economics, they don't correspond to lived social space. So and then they're insufficient to the challenges that we face, insufficient to think about ecological collapse, neo-colonial dynamics, racism, patriarchal discrimination, etc. I think we're all familiar with this territory. And it's from there, I think, one way amongst many of rethinking economics is to really work hard at taking economics and take our inquiry, and instead of kind of using this method, this gesture that we've often used to kind of strip away social space and put things in abstract space, to situate our inquiry right back in the noise of social space. It's right here where I think film can do that. when we, and I'll speak on that more now. I also just want to throw out the idea that, and I'll pick this up later, but the idea is that there's some correspondence between how we do pedagogy and how we do theory, that the very theory that we produce as researchers and as thinkers and as scholars working together, that I think that has a correspondence, maybe not the most direct, but that correlates to the way that we teach and the methods that we employ. So that's something I want to continue thinking about. So I'm gonna just to put a fine point on it, I'm gonna hop right in with an example from a class that I taught exploring. The name of the class was Labor and Economics Through Film. It was a freshman's first year seminar class. We watched film. We talked about some of the dynamics sitting behind that film, and then read how would economists talk about some of these dynamics, and can we find something here that's useful for our inquiry. So one film that we watched was this 2010 film, Made in Dagenham, which is a, sorry, did I go back to, let's go here. Made in Dagenham is a 2010 British comedy about a women's strike in a Ford plant in London that was for equal pay in 1968. What we did is watch this film outside of class, read some articles about the gender pay gap outside of class and things that can be done to remedy it, or if it exists, etc. And then move into a discussion from there, launched from thinking about this film. So we read two articles, not particularly academic, but that were by two economists who had written their popular versions of their research work. One was economist Diana Furchtgott-Roth, who wrote about this idea that the gender wage gap does not exist. Miller, arguing that the gender pay gap does exist. Perhaps some of you have encountered the argument that the gender wage gap does not exist. Sorry if you have. And it's an argument I've noticed that does have particular sway over particularly a kind of first year, eager young, often male economics student who's moving. This argument that the gender wage gap doesn't exist functions on the idea that this weird idea of equal pay for equal work. So to just explore this article for a little bit here, as Furchtgott-Roth explores it. Here in this schema, we have different pay grades. Just for the sake of illustration, yellow circles represent men, and this was a lesson that we worked through that I'm going to work through very quick with students after watching this film, and then reading these articles. Here, these little yellow circles represent men, and these green circles represent women at different levels of pay. Essentially, the argument that the gender wage gap doesn't exist is this idea that there's equal pay for equal work. So at this band, at the lowest band of the corporate ladder, everyone makes 15 shillings per pay period, 30 shillings per pay period, 60 shillings per pay period, etc. And it's this fairly simple econometric technique by saying, hey, let's just look at what level of work people operate at. That's the pay that they receive. John Miller, on the other hand, works in a different way, in a way that's perhaps more intuitive and just kind of adds up. The average pay from in another perspective is looking here and saying the average pay for men on the right side of the screen is 37.5 shillings per whatever pay period. I made up these numbers last night. And for women is 25 shillings per pay period. And what we push students to do then, to think through this film and to talk about this film, is when these economists have modeled the gender wage gap, when they've thought about the gender wage gap, what have they actually done? How have they taken these kind of complex array of powered social dynamics and modeled them in order to say something meaningful? So what kind of patriarchy is operative in here? And in Fergschatz Roth's article, it's implicit, but it's there. The idea is that the patriarchy that's being tested for is sexist people who work at human resources office. And every time a pay period comes around, they say, we are going to pay women 79 cents on the dollar for men. And we can see that there's some glee. They're a bit chuffed to say, hey, you know what? That doesn't really happen. And the econometric truth of the matter there is that while the gender pay gap is diminished, it still exists, but it's not the 4 to 5 ratio that it is otherwise. But by taking this question of by just looking at, when we look at the people who are paid 15 shillings, there's not gender discrimination amongst the people who are paid 15 shillings. There's not gender discrimination amongst the people who are paid 45 shillings. There's almost a tautology to the argument. When we look at the argument that the gender wage gap exists, precisely what's going on is, why is the pay pyramid stacked in this way? Why is it that women end up in the jobs at the bottom of the pay distribution? And in that, we can see a lot more things happening in terms of gender segregation, in terms of employment, in terms of expectations of motherhood and fatherhood, what kinds of roles women and men should play in the family. That extends to thinking about care labor. What do social expectations of care labor mean? Can also think about gendered violence in this regard. Think about different forms of intimidation that play on gendered violence, and this idea of women and men who engage in similar behaviors. Women get read and castigated, excuse my language, as bitchy, where men engaging in the same behaviors are rewarded for being resolute. I think what was helpful about thinking about this is that when you watch this film made in Dagenham, it of course involves all of the things which happen on the shop floor at the Ford plant, all of the struggles between women who are working in the Ford plant, segregated in one particular, the upholstery of the vehicles. But it also includes the home life, life at bars and nightclubs, the different kinds of matrices of social power that are involved and that clearly have an effect on the way in which gender in the workplace is one piece of gender in social life more broadly. And if we really want to think about the gender pay gap, this thinking, oh, equal pay for equal work or banding, this isn't sufficient to really asking the question about, hey, how do patriarchal structures kind of express themselves at the workplace? But we had a longer setup to it. We had students kind of work it out and think through it in different ways. Just for the sake of time, I think I'll move on there though. Some other films and topics that I've had the ability to explore. I've worked with a group called the Center for Popular Economics here, which actually sounds kind of similar to the Chisimani Center. It does different kinds of popular education for activist groups, unions, etc., and put on a film festival there, and then invited speakers to come talk on different topics. And then through a class that I've also been able to teach, this one, Labor and Economics Through Film. Just want to talk through some of the different films that have been on there and different things that we've been able to think about. Ava DuVernay, she directed The Middle of Nowhere in 2012, which we used to think about mass incarceration in the neoliberal era. A wonderful film, Nairobi Half-Life, by David Toshkitonga. It's set in Kenya. We use the backdrop of that film to think about urbanization and structural adjustment. A great film called Out of My Hand by Takeshi Fukunaga. It's set both in rural Liberia and New York City. We talked about both the kind of economics of emigration and immigration and some different things at stake in both of those. A Dutch film called 2 Days, 1 Night by the Dardenne brothers, set in Belgium over the course of 2 days and 1 night. Thought about different kinds of capitalist strategy in engaging and dividing workers. A film called Matewan from near where I'm from, set in rural Appalachia in the 1920s, and as this, I've used that with my students to teach about just a general surplus framework, and then how capitalists, in this case coal miners, used racial tension between established white workers, Black workers from the US South, and Italian immigrants in West Virginia to divide and increase their surplus extraction. Under the Same Moon, a 2007 film, we used that to look at immigration, particularly informal work in the United States. Peoply Live was a film we used to discuss agricultural poverty and debt. Is a film set in India, made in 2010. One thing I'd be very interested to hear from you all. I'm not particularly a scholar of film. I watch, I think, a very normal amount of films, and I'm always keen to hear different recommendations. But I'd be particularly excited to hear from y'all and think about more African film, and particularly South African film. My work is in East Africa, and in East and Central Africa, there's a series of films, Viva Riva, Boda Boda Thieves, Rafiki, that I think are particularly engaging and would be fun to work with. I think one of the general ideas, though, that, and this is my last little piece here, but one of the general ideas that I'm operating with is this idea that film or any narrative really always has some implicit or explicit structure of production and distribution that sits behind that narrative. And if there's a system of production and distribution, we can talk about that. We can think about that. So I want to say here, in this broad sense, this is just any narrative, any kind of humanistic narrative, from rap to folk music, from literature, from novels to films. Here's a few Kenyan and one Argentine pieces that just for time I won't hop into. And at best, what this can do, what using narrative in this way, can stoke and engage student interest, expand what people think of as the economic, move people away from thinking the stock market or what happens in the formal sector. We can then take our understandings of what the economic is and situate it in these other matrices and networks of social power, and kind of get away from our models, which just exist in abstract Euclidean space, and situate them in very lived social space. Not confusing the picture, taking what we know from economics, but not divorcing it from other structures and matrices of power. We can then kind of enable meaningful questions, and there's what I mean by how our pedagogy can match our research, or can correspond to our research. We can start to think differently, and then show students, show participants, show different ways of how we can kind of marshal that towards a critical inquiry. We can ask a different set of questions than we've been asking before. Sorry, I went over time. I'm just gonna pop out there. Thanks, y'all.
No, that's fine. I know the time limits are very difficult for everyone to keep to. But I was wondering if it would be strategic for us to go into the breakout rooms for the full 15 minutes, because we are a little bit behind time. I think it would be a good opportunity now for us to go into the breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and we can then come back in and have a discussion with the speakers, ask any questions. I think it would be good to go to the breakout rooms now, because both Phindile and Jonathan have given us a lot to think about in terms of how to engage with people at a particular level and to try to get them to think differently about a subject or a topic or an issue, a social justice matter maybe, in the case of Phindile's work. So I would be keen to get an idea of, you know, if you're in a group together with 5 other people who are in this chat, and you had the opportunity to give a 1-hour lesson to a group of first years, undergrad first years, about a topic related to labor and work. I just want you to list down some ideas that each of you can come up with on how you would approach that, and how you would use a creative method, not the typical slides and lecture room method, because learning doesn't just happen in the classroom. So for example, if I were to talk about informality, maybe take a group of first years to a waste compound and get them to engage with waste reclaimers about what they do, how much they earn, that kind of thing. So be as creative as you want to be. You have 10 minutes. So we'll come back into this room in 10 minutes and we'll have a bit of time to wrap up the discussion. But I really hope that this exercise can give you some time to think a bit more deeply about what questions you have about labor and work and how to communicate them to an undergrad class or to younger people who are studying economics. And if you are an undergrad, you're in a perfect position because you'd be given the opportunity to tell us, you know, the way that you would like to learn about something. And you can do that through, you know, thinking about your past experiences, learning economics, and maybe not really engaging with the material because it wasn't presented to you in a way that was accessible. So it will be 5 of you approximately per breakout room.